There is a quiet exchange many people make without ever noticing the trade taking place, handing someone else the job of deciding whether today was a good day or a difficult one. A glance, a tone of voice, a delayed reply, and suddenly an entire mood shifts, decided by someone who likely wasn't even thinking about the moment at all. This isn't weakness, and it isn't vanity either. It's simply an old, deeply human habit that quietly forgot to update itself over time. In this journey, we look gently at 12 small reasons approval feels so necessary, and the quiet, ordinary ways a person can slowly begin answering that question for themselves. The hidden cost of meeting others' nods. Old court painters, working for wealthy patrons centuries ago, would often quietly alter a finished portrait after watching the patron's face during the unveiling, softening a jawline or brightening a color the moment they noticed the smallest flicker of displeasure. Their own trained eye, the one they had studied light and shadow for years, would suddenly matter less than a single passing expression on someone else's face. The truest version of the painting, ironically, rarely survived that particular moment of watching and waiting for approval. Something remarkably similar happens in far more ordinary settings today, in the way a person might quietly rewrite an opinion, a plan, or even a simple preference the moment they sense mild disapproval forming on someone else's face nearby. The original thought, honestly held only seconds earlier, gets softened or abandoned entirely before it ever gets the chance to be properly spoken aloud. Nobody forces this change. It happens quietly, almost automatically, without much conscious thought involved at all, long before the person even notices the shift taking place inside them. The actual cost rarely shows up all at once in any single dramatic moment, but rather accumulates slowly across years of small edits made for an audience that may not have even been paying close attention in the first place. Each small adjustment feels harmless alone, yet together they slowly replace an original honest voice with something quieter and far less certain. The portrait, so to speak, keeps changing long after the artist should have felt finished with it, long after the true likeness had already quietly disappeared. Why approval feels like safety, not praise. A human infant, entirely unable to feed or protect itself, depends completely on a caregiver's steady attention simply to survive its earliest months of life, long before words or reasoning are even possible. A caregiver's warm smile wasn't experienced as a compliment back then. It was experienced as confirmation that safety, food, and comfort would continue a little longer. This early wiring rarely disappears just because a person eventually grows old enough to feed and protect themselves entirely on their own. This may explain why approval from others can feel less like a simple compliment and more like a small wave of physical relief washing quietly through the body, a feeling closer to safety returning than pride arriving. A raised eyebrow or a cool tone of voice from someone important can trigger something disproportionate to the actual moment, echoing an older, more urgent kind of danger. The nervous system, in this sense, is still running some very old and outdated software. Recognizing this pattern doesn't make the reaction disappear instantly, the way understanding a fire alarm doesn't stop the sound from making the heart race a little faster anyway. But it does offer a small, useful reminder that the current moment likely isn't the survival emergency the body seems to think it is right now. Most disapproval today, however uncomfortable it feels in the moment, rarely threatens food, shelter, or safety at all, no matter how urgent it briefly seems in that first instant of noticing it. 3 quick discoveries worth sitting with. A baby's smile and an adult's approval activate strangely similar feelings of safety in the body. The fear of disappointing someone often outweighs the fear of the actual consequence itself, and naming this pattern out loud tends to quietly loosen its grip, a childhood habit that outlives its purpose. Many children growing up in unpredictable households develop a quiet, constant habit of scanning a parent's face and tone the moment they enter a room, checking carefully for signs of a good mood or a difficult one before saying or doing anything else at all, however small. This scanning wasn't overthinking or unnecessary worry. It was a genuinely useful skill that helped a small child navigate an environment that could shift without much warning at all, sometimes within a single afternoon. The trouble is that this same careful scanning habit rarely retires once a person grows up and leaves that unpredictable household far behind them, often decades later in entirely different circumstances. The habit simply finds new faces to read instead, a boss, a partner, a friend, quietly checking each one for signs of approval or disapproval before relaxing fully into any ordinary room or conversation. The original danger has long since passed, yet the careful watching continues on regardless, quietly, in the background of an otherwise ordinary life. This is why some adults feel a strange, persistent tension entering rooms that hold no real danger at all, a meeting, a family dinner, an ordinary gathering among old friends. The tension isn't really about the room itself or the people currently standing inside it. It's a much older habit still faithfully doing a job nobody actually needs it to do anymore. Recognizing where the habit began is often the very first step toward gently retiring it, one ordinary room and one ordinary day at a time. Ahead in this video, we look closely at the exact moment a person's own sense of worth quietly gets handed over to someone else entirely. The moment self-worth quietly changes hands. A capable, accomplished woman once admitted to a close friend that her entire sense of how the day had gone depended almost completely on her manager's tone of voice during one single morning meeting, regardless of anything else that happened for the remaining hours afterward. A warm tone meant a good day was somehow guaranteed, while a distracted or curt tone meant the rest of the day would quietly feel ruined, no matter what actually followed it, hours later, once the meeting was long over. This quiet handover happens so gradually that most people never notice the exact moment it occurred. The moment an internal sense of worth got outsourced entirely to someone else's mood, opinion, or passing reaction that particular day, without any real announcement. Once handed over, that sense of worth becomes remarkably fragile, rising and falling with someone else's schedule, stress, or simply how well they happened to sleep the night before, entirely out of anyone's actual control at all, day after day. Taking that sense of worth back rarely happens through one dramatic decision made in a single defining moment, the way it was never lost through one dramatic moment either, but through many small, quiet handovers instead, spread across years of ordinary mornings. Noticing the handover as it happens, even once, even briefly, is often the very first small step toward eventually keeping that sense of worth exactly where it always should have stayed, safely at home, undisturbed. Why some compliments never feel believable. A talented musician who received warm, genuine applause after every single performance for years still described feeling secretly convinced the audience simply hadn't noticed her mistakes clearly enough that particular evening, no matter how many times the applause repeated itself afterward, night after night. The compliment arrived reliably and consistently, yet it never seemed to fully land or settle anywhere inside her, sliding off almost as quickly as it had arrived in the first place, unclaimed, night after night. This happens because a compliment that contradicts a person's existing, deeply held self-image tends to get quietly filtered out by the mind before it can properly register or take root, treated almost like a strange error rather than useful, accurate information worth keeping around. The mind, in a sense, trusts its own old, familiar story about itself far more readily than any single kind sentence spoken by someone else, however sincerely and warmly it was actually meant to be received. This is why compliments alone, however frequent or genuinely meant they happen to be, rarely fix this particular pattern on their own, without something else quietly changing first underneath the surface, well before any words ever arrive. The old, familiar story needs gently updating from the inside, before any outside praise can actually find somewhere solid to land and comfortably stay for good. Otherwise, kind words simply keep arriving at a door that was quietly built to stay closed, no matter how often it's knocked on. The quiet test of an empty room. Old violin makers, after finishing a new instrument, would often play it alone in an empty workshop, long before any customer ever heard a single note, listening carefully for a warmth in the tone that only revealed itself in complete privacy, without anyone else present to please or perform for. If the instrument sounded genuinely good in that empty room, with nobody watching or listening, it was considered finished and ready to finally meet the world outside. No further adjustments needed at all. This same quiet test applies rather well to a person's own sense of worth, tried out privately in an empty room with nobody present at all to notice, judge, or offer any praise afterward. Does a small personal accomplishment still feel satisfying when nobody else will ever hear about it or witness it happening? Does a quiet moment of pride still feel real when there is no audience anywhere nearby to confirm or applaud it? Or does it quietly need someone else watching to feel true at all? Many people discover, somewhat uncomfortably at first, that very little actually holds up well under this particular empty room test, since so much of daily life quietly happens with half an eye already watching for someone else's reaction to it. Yet the things that do pass this quiet private test tend to feel remarkably sturdy afterward, the way a well-made violin sounds just as true alone as it ever does in front of any crowd, watching or not, applauding or silent. For a quiet moment, think of one small thing you did recently that nobody else ever noticed or praised at all. Notice how it still feels sitting there quietly, entirely on its own. That small private feeling may be closer to real self-worth than any compliment ever could be. A forgotten skill called self-witnessing. Old herbalists, long before modern medicine existed in its current form, would often taste and test their own remedies personally before ever offering them to a single patient, trusting their own careful observation over any secondhand report or outside opinion about what worked and what didn't. Their own direct experience mattered more than any rumor or hearsay circulating through the village at the time, however popular or widely repeated it happened to be among the neighboring households and traveling merchants passing through. Most people today rarely extend themselves this same simple courtesy, waiting instead for someone else to confirm whether their own effort, choice, or ordinary day actually counted for anything real at all in the end. Self-witnessing simply means quietly noticing one's own experience directly, without immediately reaching for a second opinion to confirm what was already clearly felt and known firsthand, long before anyone else weighed in on the matter at all. This forgotten skill rarely requires anything dramatic or complicated to practice regularly. Only a small pause at the end of an ordinary day to notice honestly and privately what actually happened and how it genuinely felt without outside commentary of any kind. Herbalists trusted their own tongue before trusting anyone else's description of the taste. And something similar seems to quietly matter here as well, in far more ordinary daily moments than anyone might first expect at first glance. Why silence from others feels like rejection. An unanswered message left sitting quietly on a phone screen for several hours can produce a surprisingly strong wave of anxiety in an otherwise calm, reasonable person, despite there being absolutely no actual evidence yet of anything having gone wrong at all. The mind, faced with genuine silence and no real information to work with, tends to quietly fill that empty gap with the worst possible explanation available, almost automatically and without much real thought given to it at all. This happens because ambiguous silence offers the mind no clear signal to properly work with. And minds shaped by long evolutionary history strongly prefer having some clear signal, even a distinctly negative one, over having none at all to interpret. A friend who simply got busy and a friend who is quietly, genuinely upset can produce the exact identical silence. Yet the anxious mind often assumes the far more painful explanation first, well before any actual evidence ever arrives to confirm either possibility. Recognizing this particular pattern doesn't make the anxious waiting disappear entirely or instantly, the way knowing about an optical illusion doesn't necessarily stop the eye from seeing it anyway, no matter how well the trick is understood. But it does offer a small, useful reminder that silence itself carries no actual meaning at all, until someone eventually quietly fills it in, one way or another, with real information rather than imagined worry conjured in an anxious moment. The difference between being liked and being known. A well-liked man at the center of nearly every social gathering in his town, greeted warmly by dozens of familiar people wherever he happened to go, once quietly admitted to a close friend that almost nobody at any of those very same gatherings actually knew what he was privately struggling with underneath the easy smile. Being liked, it turns out, and being genuinely known by someone else are simply not always quite the same thing at all, no matter how warm and familiar the greetings tend to feel each time. Approval tends to reward the version of a person that gets carefully presented outward to others, the pleasant, agreeable, easy version that rarely causes any friction or discomfort for anyone else nearby at any point. Being truly known by comparison requires showing something considerably less polished and controlled, the parts a person doesn't always feel especially proud of sharing openly, even with people they otherwise trust and care about deeply and consistently over many years of steady friendship. Chasing approval alone can quietly fill a calendar with warm, friendly gatherings, while somehow still leaving a person feeling strangely unseen and unknown by nearly everyone actually present in that very same crowded room, night after night. Being deeply known by even one or two people, by contrast, tends to feel considerably steadier over time than being lightly liked by an entire wide and ever-changing crowd that never quite settles into anything lasting. A strange habit of truly grounded people. An old farmer, well respected throughout his quiet region for decades of careful, steady work, was once asked by a curious visitor what his neighbors generally thought of his particular farming methods, and he simply replied, quite honestly, that he genuinely had no idea and had honestly never once asked them directly. His fields spoke clearly enough for themselves, in his own steady estimation, regardless of whatever opinion any neighbor happened to privately hold about his particular methods or choices over the years. Truly grounded people, observed closely across very different professions and very different walks of life, tend to share this same strange, almost unremarkable habit of rarely asking others directly what they think of them personally, year after year. This isn't coldness or genuine indifference toward other people at all. It's simply that their own steady sense of worth was never actually built to depend on collecting outside opinions in the first place, one by one, from everyone they happen to meet. This particular habit can look, from the outside looking in, almost like quiet confidence or unusual self-assurance. Yet it often runs considerably deeper than simple confidence alone typically does on its own. It reflects a person who has already quietly finished asking themselves the important question directly, and therefore feels little genuine need to keep asking everyone else the exact same question all over again, day after day, meeting after meeting. The old practice of answering yourself first. Old ship navigators, long before modern instruments existed to double-check every calculation instantly, were trained to check their own compass and careful calculations first, privately, before ever consulting a second officer's independent opinion about the ship's current position or heading, no matter how urgent the crossing felt. Consulting someone else immediately, before forming one's own careful judgment first, was considered a genuine weakness, rather than a strength among experienced captains of that particular era and profession. This old practice offers a rather useful, quietly practical model for questions of self-worth as well. Answering an honest question about oneself privately and directly, before immediately reaching outward for someone else's opinion or reassurance on the exact same matter at hand. A person's own honest, carefully considered answer, arrived at first and privately, tends to hold up rather differently over time than one borrowed immediately and secondhand from someone else entirely, however well-meaning that person happened to be. This doesn't mean other opinions never matter at all, or should always be ignored entirely and dismissed out of hand, since a second trusted opinion certainly helped many old captains navigate safely through genuinely difficult waters over the years. But the old navigators checked their own instruments first, quietly, before ever asking, and that particular order, it turns out, seems to matter rather a lot in the end, long after the voyage is complete. The gentle shift from watched to whole. Certain old gardens were designed deliberately to bloom fully only at night, their pale, fragrant flowers opening slowly under moonlight, long after every visitor had already gone home for the evening, and the garden gate had been quietly locked behind them for the night. Nobody stood there each night specifically to witness the blooming happen, and the flowers, quite simply, opened fully regardless of whether anyone at all was actually present to see it happen or admire it. A person's own sense of worth seems capable of learning something rather similar over time, slowly opening more fully in ordinary, unwitnessed moments, rather than only during the moments carefully arranged for others to notice and approve of one by one. The shift from constantly being watched toward feeling genuinely whole rarely arrives with any dramatic announcement or clear turning point, the way a garden never announces the exact night its flowers finally decide to bloom for the first time. Perhaps loving oneself without needing approval was never really about convincing anyone else of anything at all, but rather about quietly continuing to open, moonlit and unwitnessed, whether or not anyone else happens to be standing nearby to notice it happening on any particular night. The garden blooms either way, season after season, and perhaps, in its own quiet time, so does the person patiently tending it. Perhaps approval was never actually the thing being sought in the first place, only a familiar, convenient stand-in for a feeling of safety that a person once genuinely needed and never fully replaced with something steadier from within. A compliment can still be enjoyed fully without needing to be believed as the final word on anything important, the way a warm day can be enjoyed without requiring it to last forever. Somewhere between an old violin tested alone in an empty room, at a quiet garden, blooming unwitnessed under nothing but moonlight, there is a gentler version of the same idea, waiting for anyone willing to notice it. Self-worth, real and steady, rarely needs an audience to confirm that it exists. It simply continues on quietly, whether watched closely or not watched at all, the way a field keeps growing regardless of who happens to be looking. Maybe it's enough, for now, to simply notice how often the question gets asked outward, and to wonder gently what might change if it were occasionally asked inward instead.